Hi, and welcome to MindSet, an HCD vidcast, where we dive into the world of applied consumer neuroscience and market research with leading experts in the field. My name is Michelle Nigella, PhD in behavioral neuroscience and Director of Research and Innovation at HCD.
And I'm Kathryn Ambrose, the Manager of Behavioral and Marketing Sciences with HCD. As your hosts, we are going to act as the buzzkills for the buzzwords, taking time to critically think about the limitations and pitfalls of emerging trends and topics within the field to help you identify what innovation has a lot of untapped potential or is too good to be true.
Now, HCD is a full-service research house which provides research capabilities on consumers by looking at how they perceive, evaluate, and respond to different types of stimuli, such as looking at product experiences, communications, or just general consumer and shopper experiences. We use a combination of tools that come from psychology, physiology, neuroscience, as well as the traditional methods that people typically use to see how they experience different stimuli. That stimuli can range from the early stages of exploration all the way through the final product validation tests. This is what we refer to as applied consumer neuroscience.
So stick around for more curious conversations as we chat our way through the ever-evolving space of consumer science. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to MindSet. We're so happy to have you. It's Kathryn and Michelle here. We are very excited. It's just the two of us today, and we are going to be discussing this new topic called Journal Club, which actually Michelle knows a little bit about because she brought this idea up. So Michelle, you want to share a little bit about what this is?
Sure. So Journal Club is something we're going to be introducing to the series as a regular segment, right? Journal Club is something that we used to do in grad school once a week, where students and professors would get together and we would discuss a journal article, so an academic research article, with the idea that that article somehow related to all of us scientifically, or that it was something we wanted to learn something more about. But the most important thing was that it was all about learning to critically think, right? Because when you are a student, or even when you're a professor, the ability to look at even some of the, biggest scientists out there, read their work and understand if something was the best way to look at it, or if the results were interpreted correctly, did they use the right statistics, but also learn something so we could all, talk about it and learn more.
Absolutely.
It's always good to stay, keep reading the science that's out there.
That makes so much sense, especially because, as we've said in previous episodes, this is the point of science, is to keep learning, keep evolving. And we want to learn from our limitations and our fallbacks, because that's how we can progress and move forward.
And that's the scientific method, right? It's not science unless you present it to the scientific community and you are open to hearing critique.
Absolutely. So the topic we are going to be covering today, it's this article that was published in Nature Communications, and it is entitled "Professional Actors Demonstrate Variability, Not Stereotypical Expressions When Portraying Emotional States in Photography." So
we are going to link this article below. So please feel free to take a look at this article yourself, but we're going to discuss it. And I actually chose this article for a couple of reasons. One, it's something that Kathryn and I are constantly talking about. You may have heard us mention this a billion times or so, but what this article is about, when it's saying professional actors demonstrating emotional states in photographs, what we are talking about is facial coding. So one of our favorite topics. So that's the first reason that I chose it. It is new. It did come out this year in 2021, or actually maybe it's next year by now when this is airing, but we're right at the tail end of 2021. So this article just came out in 2021. So that was another reason, right? Another reason is because it actually is the main author on this, the last author on the list, is someone that Kathryn and I tend to fangirl over, Lisa Feldman Barrett. We absolutely love her for a million reasons. She's a great, brilliant scientist, but also because she's very open and critically thinking about theory of emotion. And I think that that's just so important.
Yeah. And the whole theme of this paper that we were reading is really looking into the theories of emotion and really analyzing what they referred to as this context sensitive hypothesis. And that's basically just talking about how expressions in the same emotional categories might be shown in several different ways. And you can see how well that ties into facial coding and looking into facial coding, because that is a fundamental thing that has to be considered when using something like
Right.
algorithms to determine what a person is feeling.
So just to kind of take a step back, whenever we look at an academic research article, they always open up with an intro, right? So kind of discussing the reason for doing this study at all, so what is the current theories that are going around? What's the justification for the approach that they used? And so what they were really talking about, what Feldman, Barrett, and the other scientists were really talking about as to reasons why, is something else that we talk about a lot, which is that there are multiple theories of emotion. I think people forget that all the time, that we don't actually know or fully understand what emotions are. So if I were to ask Kathryn, what's an emotion? Now, she might have a different definition because we talk about it so much, but probably most people would say they would name an emotion, right?
Right. And honestly, if you were to ask that to me, I still think even with all of our conversations, I would still just start naming off other emotions, especially because that's how other people relate to it and connect to it. So if I'm trying to make it something that is understood for the general population, I would just go to using different examples of emotions to
Right.
describe it, since it's really hard to put into
It
words what
is.
emotions are.
I mean, so I think the way that it is actually classically defined is saying that it's some sort of event that, a feeling that you have that changes your physiology as well as influences your behavior. That, is a change of state, right? So it's kind of a combination of things that you have a psychological mood component, but you also have a physiological component. And I think that shows up in the definitions or the theories of emotion that are out there. You have the physiological ones, the classic ones. You have the categorical ones, which is more in relation to what we're looking at here. You have the multidimensional ones, like the Lang-Mahabrian ones, right? So there's a lot of different approaches. And this one was really focusing on the categorical, which is the idea that there are basic emotions, right? And it's interesting that they reviewed some of the history in this intro, because I think a lot of times when we think of facial coding and we think of basic emotions, we're often stuck in the seven basic, right? The Ekman basic emotions. But there's actually a lot of research out there that are in this sort of categorical view, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. And it's more than just the seven basic emotions, even though like it's depending on what theory you look at, they give or take some categories or whatever it is, but the idea still remains the same, that what you are looking at is the way that you have an expression on your face is equal to an emotion, and that it's has to be only that one emotion. It can't be a combination or a mixture or anything like that, which is really important to consider.
But those basic emotions are the ones we typically think of when we're asked to define, right? So it's anger, sadness, happiness, these confusion, like those types of things that are basic, and they're considered basic and universal, because the idea is that the history of the research that was done was that if you showed these facial expressions to anyone, or if you asked people to express these emotions, that universally anywhere in the world, people could recognize and emote those basic emotions. So, in Ekman's world, it's like 7, but if you look at all of research around the categorical emotional theory space, I think there's most commonly 13.
Right. And that we should note that she did this article doesn't go off of Ekman's 7 basic emotions. It has quite a few. So they include certain emotions like amusement or awe or contempt, which is always, in Ekman's, sometimes contempt's there, sometimes it's not. But it's so it's quite interesting, because also something like pride that is brought up, or interest that is used in these emotions are challenging to determine.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, because, a real problem with the 7 basic from Ekman is that there's only one positive, like
Yeah.
happiness/joy, whatever you want to call it, is the only positive one. And the rest of them are either the one neutral or all negative, like sadness and anger and disgust. But the main thing that Feldman, Barrett, and all of them wanted to study in this was they wanted to look at emotion from this basic view, right? So the basic emotions, they went with the 13 that were most popular in the research. So by looking at all the research that looks at basic emotions, they went with the most popular ones. And they wanted to know about whether expressing emotions on the face is different with or without context. I think that's sort of the main driver in this study, was wanting to know the effect of context, which makes total sense because Lisa Feldman Barrett is very much of the
Context
contextual, the context queen, that, context matters.
Yes.
But the research questions and what she was really addressing in this is, are the current ways we look at this, is it reliable? Is, looking at facial expressions, is it a reliable measure of people's emotions? And also, is it specific?
Right, exactly. And it helps to think about too, just taking that theory and then applying it to your own life. Consider if you're at home versus in the office.
Mhm.
There's so many variables that go into how you're planning on emoting yourself or sharing
Yeah,
how how you portray, because if you're talking to a stranger, you might act very, very differently compared to talking to a coworker or
right.
talking to a really, really good friend.
Mhm.
Though all of those variables play a role in how somebody is going to end up
We
portraying
do
themselves.
filter ourselves in different contexts, right? So, we may not want to be as emotional when we're at work, right? Or when
Exactly.
we're riding the train, as opposed to when we're at home with family or describing something to a friend. I think, one of the questions they pose in the study is also, do we all scowl when we're angry?
Mm.
And I kind of liked that idea, thinking about that, because it reminded me, like, a billion years ago when I first started a blog. It was nerdoscientist.com, which is a whole nother story in its own. But I was, this was before, like, really becoming like the being on the soapbox all the time about facial coding. But one thing that really struck me was the idea that, people have these universal faces for anger. And it really made me think of tennis players,
Mm.
interestingly enough, because if you watch tennis players, when they make a hit, right? So when they hit something and they do really well, they actually look very angry, you know?
No, it's very true. It's very true. It's hard to be able to interpret what what they're thinking. But
Yeah, I
again,
mean, if you
in
just,
context.
Google faces of McEnroe, you are just going to see a lot of seriously angry faces,
I'm
even though
picturing
he's
you
like,
doing this.
yeah, like throwing a racket, and screaming "Arr!" because you made the shot.
Right. Right. Exactly. And then compare that to a soccer player who barely gets tapped and they're, or football player for any of our European listeners, um, uh, on the floor rolling around and things like their expression is going to be very different. And even though they had two different reactions to something that maybe it should look the same, but it doesn't, it's very
Right.
interesting. And again, this goes to show it's context specific, because if they're on the court making that face, maybe it means that they did really well.
Yeah.
They're making it
But
off.
why is this important, right? And I think there's some real ethical issues here when we think why it's important to validate, because essentially when you're looking to make sure that this type of measure is reliable and specific, then you're trying to say, is it even a valid approach?
Mhm.
Right? That's essentially, is facial coding, even though it's not in the title, we're all talking about facial coding here, really. Is it a valid approach? So I really love this paper, right? Because I think it brings up a really good question in that.
Right.
And
And basically,
it's an ethical issue because
yes.
people are using facial coding in cars, right? People are using facial coding to determine if there is a domestic threat in crowds. People are using it in market research to make business decisions, billions of dollars of research money is being used to say whether or not to go with one product or another, or one design or another, all based on something that may or may not be valid.
Right. Which is, it's scary, honestly, because the implications of trusting something to make such big decisions
Yeah.
are huge. They're
Yeah.
huge. And what it really comes to is any algorithm, including facial coding, or say you have like a professional facial coder, they're following a specific type of
Yeah.
methodology that does make it inherently biased. Like there are
Yeah.
biases to facial coding.
So that brings us to the methodologies they used, right? So I think that's a really important place to bring it up, because they looked at two samples, right? One was where they wanted to look at variations, similarities in facial expressions of emotions. So they had actors' pictures of specific emotions, and they weren't ones that they created. This actually is a sort of book of emotional faces done by professional actors. And these emotions had a backstory, right?
And it was interesting backstories too.
Oh yeah. Yeah. It wasn't just show me sad. It was like your boyfriend cheated on you and now you're devastated. Show me that face. And this was like, it's supposed to be like a handbook, like a training book, I think, for actors on how to express emotion. Right.
Yeah. And I would want to note, I took note of one of the examples that was given, because I found it really interesting that it was very intentional, the words that they used, because there was no emotional words within the description. So that way, and that was done to try to avoid biases. So for example, they used, he is a motorcycle dude coming out of a biker bar, just as a guy in a Porsche backs into his gleaming Harley. And it's funny because, first of all, they use the word dude, which I love.
So a motorcycle dude coming out of a bar and seeing somebody back into his Harley, right?
It's
you can imagine.
Yes.
Yeah, it's very specific. That guy's face might be quite different from, say, my toddler who just lost her toy, right?
Right.
Both
Exactly.
angry.
But the thing is, there's no sign of angry in the actual prompt. It's an interpreted thing that somebody would be angry.
And it may not be a scowl. It may not be McEnroe throwing his racket, right? You could have a deadpan face motorcycle guy, dude, staring down the person who just backed into, like,
their Harley.
Like, really?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not scowling. You know?
It's a different way to show that you're upset. You know, it's really interesting. And who knows, maybe the person's not upset. Like, we are assuming they're upset, but maybe that person is relieved because they're about to get a lot of insurance money. And, you know, we don't know the full picture, the
full backstory, but all those things would affect their facial expression, right?
Exactly.
And that's basically what this study is showing. But one thing I thought was interesting, since you were bringing up like facial action coding, right? And how that's done, whether it's an algorithm or whether it's expert coders. In this study, they used expert coders, and they said it was because there were too many problems with the computerized version. And I really love that, because that's what everybody's using right now.
Yeah. I also noticed that. And it's
specifically stereotypes was brought up, right?
Yeah. And that just goes to show the concern that people have in terms of using a computerized facial coding system. And the fact that people are using it, even though it may be enticing, and, you know, there are some ways that you could sell facial coding really easily in a computerized system, especially in the world we live in. But if you sit back and think
fraught
about
with
it,
error,
right?
I mean, it's fraught with error. So let's just pretend we just accept the basic emotion approach, which I think this study would suggest that we shouldn't. But if we were to accept the basic emotions approach, the problem is that there's still so many issues with computerized facial coding. It stereotypes emotions. It oversimplifies emotions. It's incredibly biased and racially biased at that. And you don't get a lot of that input. Well, you get no input on context because it's just going off of action coding, right? Action units, which is just like the individual little movements of different muscle groups. Gosh,
it's frustrating
it is
because
frustrating. That's if you accept the theory, which again, this study really tears down the theory, I think.
I agree. I totally agree. And I
Yeah.
think that it is interesting that they made that decision to use professional facial coders, because it goes to show even the best of this
Yeah.
tool has inherent
Yeah.
issues in it.
Even if you try to remove the problems from the algorithms, doing your best. Like they even tried to just concentrate on labeling of emotions that were relevant, right? They tried to have still images to make sure everything was just the same for each of the coders, to just really try to eliminate any noise, and you still get all, like, so this is best case scenario, and you still get all these problems. So again, what they did first, right, was to look at, so they have the scenarios and they have the pictures. So they wanted participants to judge the scenarios, right? So here's your scenarios. Motorcycle dude walks out of a bar, sees somebody knocked down as hardly. How would you describe his emotional state, right?
Exactly.
So they did that.
Right. And what I thought was interesting as well, I would want to note that the professional facial coders had 100% accuracy based on the way that they were trained to do the work. So it's not like they
were acting like machines here.
Exactly. They are professionals. They did it 100% accurately. And even in doing it 100% accurately, there were situations where emotions can't be isolated to specific behaviors. There is that disconnect. And it's very interesting that you can't assume that smiling only means that you're happy. It's shown through this study.
So the first thing was to check, okay, what are the emotions that are in these scenarios? And then what are the experts saying from these pics, these emotional pictures that are from those scenarios, right? And is there alignment? So they did cluster analyses, they did Bayesian modeling. I mean, they did some massively serious stats, right? So the second thing they did, right, so that's with the looking at the scenarios and looking at the professional coders. So a different group of people they took, and they had those people judge the pictures. Exactly. Right. So here it was, now they chose emotions from the list. And this is trying to figure out, are these emotions universal? Right.
Yeah, exactly. And it was really interesting because especially if we start to talk about the second study a bit more, they really honed in on that idea of context by choosing what it would be like having that face, that emotional, that same face in different contexts. So
and this wasn't like a small group of people. This was like almost 900 people.
Yeah. There was quite a good sample size for this. And it was interesting because the situation showed that the emotional meanings came from the comprehensive understanding of the scene as opposed to just that person's face. And so by having context, we as humans, and it makes sense rationally, like we as humans use context all the time, like we were saying, to interpret what is happening and how you should react to a situation. So that speaks volumes too. And the thing is that the AI or like we're looking back at computer facial coding, that's not able to determine things like context because their focus is on the face, and its code will always do what the code is saying to do.
Yeah. So, I mean, can you imagine getting pulled out of an airport security line because, AI has identified you as a threatening person when perhaps someone just stepped on your foot, or maybe, maybe you're back in row and something wonderful just happened and you're like, so, it's just, that's dangerous.
Oh, absolutely. And There is a study that I read about in the past that actually focused on airport security and how dogs have inaccurate biases. And they're like, why is the dog all messed up or whatever? And it's actually not the dog. If you look into it a little bit more, you consider more of the context, you see that the dog is picking up the cues of the handler.
Clever Hans.
Right. And so if you are, if you are the handler and you have your own personal biases, the dog is going to pick up on that and then make more false positives or whatever it is to bring people out and, have them drug tested or whatnot.
We're all incredibly biased and we pass that on to others. Like even a trained dog. Right. And I bring up Clever Hans because that was the horse that could do math. Right. And it turned out it was just taking cues from the handler.
Right.
So the horse couldn't do math.
Unfortunately, not yet.
Yeah. But okay. So the findings, right? So the findings here, context matters.
Yeah.
Like you were saying, that was the first important thing here is that the in context interpretations. So they had people that saw the images with context and the people saw the images without context. So facial emotion expression with or without context. And those interpretations were different.
Right. And it's like, what does that mean? What does that mean? It shows that there is variability. It shows that there are, there's a reason people say leave room for interpretation.
Yeah.
So
there was no reliability. That's one of the things they were looking for. And there was no specificity. That all means that we cannot be confident on making any inferences on emotion.
Right, exactly. The same facial configuration in different contexts can mean different things. And
People
that is so
convey
important.
emotion in context sensitive ways. Right.
Yeah.
So this definitely supports what Lisa Feldman Barrett has been preaching for some time now. Right. And it also supports what we've been saying about facial coding being really messy.
Yes. Yeah. And it's messy because the truth of the matter is emotions are messy.
Yeah.
And that's what it comes to is
emotions are messy. I mean, we just know that inherently as humans, we know emotions are messy, right? Emotional, when you describe someone as being emotional, that's not seen as a positive thing. It's often seen as being messy, right?
Yeah.
It's because it's complicated and that's difficult.
Right. And it's not the tool's fault because the tool's doing what it's programmed
doing exactly what
do.
you trained it to do.
Right. Or the facial coder is doing what they are trained to do. The professional facial coder.
Which is where the bias comes from too. So another thing they mentioned in the conclusions was that, so much of facial coding, the whole approach is based on Western stereotypes. Like they really kept mentioning the stereotype issue. And what does that mean? It means that we are oversimplifying emotions. I mean, it's kind of such a joke that comes up every now and then that in the English language, for example, right? So just as biases, in the English language, we're missing a lot of words that other cultures have words for. Germans, for example, have wonderful words to describe different scenarios that the English language simply doesn't have. So there's a bias in oversimplification. Taking the whole human emotional experience and boiling it down to 7.
Questionable.
Yeah.
Very questionable.
The only positive emotion is joy, when I would suggest that people have a broad range of positive emotions, right?
Oh yeah. Being ecstatic versus being happy. That's leaps and bounds away from each other. It's
relaxation, tranquility, like this state of calm is not joy, but it is positive,
right? Right. And people enjoy it. Exactly. Yeah. Or satisfaction, all of these things, all these words or lack of words that we have for even emotions that don't have words, but they have feelings to them.
Right. It's aligned with that oversimplification thing that there's somehow some sort of single emotion, just anger, right? Or just one word, anger. That is just making a stereotype. I mean, again, you think of that biker dude coming out of the bar. I mean, maybe if you had to choose of the 7, it's probably anger. It's probably not disgust, but that is an oversimplification of what he's experiencing right there.
Oh yeah. Oh, 100%. And the way I think about it too is if you are doing a study and you're looking at stats and things like that, how can you make something like your p-value really, really, like you can work on your p-value and make it what you want it to be under 0.05 by generalizing. And you can generalize and generalize and generalize. And the thing is, you can generalize to make it the most vague statement in the entire world, but you will be 100% accurate because it means nothing. You know, it has no meaning to it. And that's kind of what it feels like here by making such a gross overgeneralization.
Really dumps it down, right?
Yeah.
Like we are so much more rich than that. I mean, so let's take one of the examples they give in the conclusions was scowling when angry, right? So as an example of how someone quote unquote should look in an anger face is that they scowl. They have like a furrowed brow and, you know, these different facial things happen that would resemble a scowl. And I thought it was really interesting that they said that for actors expressing anger, all the different anger scenarios, right? So if you took that data from the first part of the study where they had people analyze the scenarios and you took all the ones that were considered to be in the angry group, only 30% of the actors actually scowled.
That is
to
very
express an
interesting.
angry scenario.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that that actually matched the same number, 30% in a meta-analysis that showed that anger was only 30% associated with scowling.
Right. Well, it again, not to beat a dead horse or anything like that, but when I am angry, just for my personal experience, if I'm really at the point of frustration, I tend to like, you know, I'll like use my hands. Like I will like hold my hands and tighten them, but it's not necessarily shown in my
You're
face.
clear here. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I'll like, or well, actually I widen my eyes. Maybe I'll be like, what? Like, or something like that. But the thing that's funny is technically like the scowl with the burrowing of the eyebrows. I do that when I'm confused or if I'm trying to concentrate on something. So I must look really angry all the time to facial coding because I do a lot of reading. So,
So that's the important part is that these things it turns out that it's highly variable.
right.
If the scowl only shows up in 30%, and we know from our experience that when you're using facial coding to look at people as they experience something like an ad or a movie or whatever it might be, it's so flat. And I wonder, it's because we've oversimplified. Like, just like you were saying before, when you oversimplify, you either miss everything or you count everything.
Yeah.
And we definitely see that in the results, and people end up being so disappointed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it really does come down to what we've been saying over and over again is that, and I will take this from part of what the study was saying is that inferences are informed by context. And that's really what it comes down to is that we are not giving humans enough credit because we have emotional intelligence. That is how we interpret things.
Understand the situation. Right. We read, I'm not just reading your face, I'm reading the situation.
Exactly. Exactly. And it really does come down to that. And I am really grateful that Michelle introduced me to this article so that way we could read it, discuss it, and hopefully everyone that's listening to this also finds it really insightful and valuable because there's so much really informative insights to gain from this study.
Yeah. Before we end it out, I just want to also bring in that apparently when you look at the emotions that they were interested in, the 13 or whatever, the more highly emotional ones, when you think about things that are a lot more like upper level, when someone's really angry or, you were talking about joy, for example, the difference between being happy and being ecstatic. As you get higher up on that emotional scale, it becomes less specific.
Right.
We got complex emotions. There's a lot going on in it. I found this article because I follow Lisa Feldman Barrett on Twitter. So I highly recommend you guys do it. If you don't already, I know we do. So
she also has a book out that's excellent about emotions. And
absolutely. Check out her YouTube videos where she gives talks. I think she did a TED talk on emotions. Really interesting stuff. So I think really important paper. If you get a chance to read it, highly recommend. Contact us to discuss it some more if you like, because we love this topic.
Exactly. So just want to thank everybody for tuning in, listening in, and without
we got one more thing.
Oh, yes. One more.
So we do our rapid fire word associations. So I'm going to have Kathryn go through this.
I'm in the hot seat today.
Yeah, you're in the hot seat this time because you often use it on me, or we do it with our guest. So I'm going to say some words and you're just going to quickly come back with the first thing that comes to your mind. Are you ready?
Let's do it.
Context.
Key.
Stereotypical.
Biased.
Actors.
Fake.
Reliability.
Trustworthy.
Lisa Feldman Barrett.
Obsessed. Very smart. Intelligent.
Validity.
Trustworthy.
Anger.
Bad.
Clusters.
Scary. I don't know. Like
Sadness.
happy.
And finally, facial coating.
Concern.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Stay safe and take care. Until next time.
Join us for the next journal club.
HCD Mindset is produced by Helen Ross. For more information or updates, follow HCD Research on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at HCD Research Inc. and at HCD Neuroscience. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and be sure to rate, review, and follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you and stay tuned for more curious conversations.